Harsh, nice to
Hi,
see you. Thank you for joining us.
thank you. No problem. Thank you for inviting me.
I apologize. I'm under the weather, so I'm going to cut my video for when you start because it's not particularly pretty. You don't want to see what's happening
Oh, I'm sorry to hear it.
here. Yeah.
No, I think it's been so long with Zoom now that I think we're all used to the video, and yeah, um, it's been an interesting semester. But we're going to start back in the fall to in-person classes, so that should be fun after 15 months of this.
So you have been teaching all Zoom until now?
Yeah, from last March until now. Yeah, yeah. Has it been the same for here in Israel, or has it been
It's
different?
been close to that, though. In the last month or two, we've been able to come back some.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this is such a big, like the scale of the school is so big that I mean, I guess all, but they just, the bureaucracy is too much. So they have to, I think only in the fall have they decided that they're going to do it. They're also going to mandate the vaccine, which is going to be interesting.
Wow. Is that
Yeah.
controversial?
Well, not in California, I think, but in other states in the U.S., some of the state governments have already passed laws forbidding universities from mandating it. So it'll be interesting. Yeah.
Um, I mean, I guess a place like Berkeley probably asks students to have other vaccines. I mean, probably
Yes.
traditionally people have had
Right.
to, so it
Yes.
ought to be more of the same.
Yes. Yes. They're afraid. I think the problem is the vaccine is only approved for it's emergency authorization right now.
Right.
So I think they are a little bit afraid of legal challenges, but I think they've decided at this point they're going with it. So yeah.
That's good. That's interesting. We're going to wait another couple of minutes for people to come. Oren, do you have announcements to make?
Um, I'll make a 2-second announcement and I'll hand it over.
Okay.
Shreeharsh, where were you born?
I was born in Mumbai, India. But so I've been in the US since 2000. So I came here for my master's, and then I worked, and then I did the PhD. So it's been a long time. It's almost 20 years now since I've been here in the US.
Wow. And during the corona, have you not been able to go back and visit family and friends?
No, not at all. I mean, I was going to actually in the summer, but then of course it exploded in India, and
Oh, yeah.
they said just don't come right now. So hopefully
The
I
graph
can.
is going down, isn't it, Shreeharsh? The numbers are
Sorry,
going. I say the graph is going down.
it's going down. Yes, yes. But yeah, it's not even clear how much. I mean, as I'm sure you've read, there's a lot of undercounting in India of the numbers.
Yeah.
So I think they're going to have to figure out what the aftermath is going to be, because I think it's been pretty rough. My dad got it, but he had the first dose of the vaccine already, so he didn't get it in. Like he was fine.
Oh, that's
Uh,
good.
Other people were not so lucky. So
Has
it's been.
Mumbai been particularly hard hit in the context
I
of
think
India?
it was hard hit, but now, like you said, the numbers are going down again. So, but even, so my father doesn't live in Mumbai anymore. He lives in a small town, but even that was hard hit. Like they were like every house in our housing colony had a case, so it was pretty bad. Should I share my screen, or should I wait until maybe a little bit
I
more?
think just wait another minute, but let's make sure that you have the,
Oh, yeah.
see, do you have the authorization to share your screen at the moment?
It looks like it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you should have.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay. I think it works.
There you go. It works. Okay, Oren, you want to?
Yeah, should we start going?
I think so. More people will come, but
For sure. Just one sec. Let me. All right. That's the middle one. Anyways, welcome everyone. It's wonderful to see you, and also that this to celebrate the end of our colloquium this year. This will be our last colloquium, and it's fabulous that Shreeharsh Kelkar could join us all the way from sunny California. Shreeharsh, thanks so much for being with us, and also at this early morning hour for you. We much appreciate it. We've had a wonderful colloquium this year. Hopefully we'll have another wonderful colloquium next year. The year, as we wrote to you, will end with the meeting of the Israeli Society for the History, Philosophy, and Sociology of Science on the 20th of June at the Van Leer Institute. And then we'll have our annual end of year party a week later. So with no further ado, again, I apologize. I'm going to take down my video because I'm under the weather, but with no further ado, thanks again, Shreeharsh, and over to you, Noah.
thank you, Oren. It is a pleasure, like you said, to introduce our speaker for today for the last colloquium of the year. And what a speaker he is. Shreeharsh Kelkar is a lecturer in interdisciplinary studies at Berkeley, as Oren said. His research describes how new assemblages of algorithms, big data, and AI are changing work practices and expertise and knowledge production. His book manuscript, which is called Reinventing Expertise, Technology Reformers, and the Platformization of Higher Education, looks into how technology reformers and their regimes of knowledge practices are reconfiguring what it means to be an educational expert. You may have seen Shreeharsh Kelkar's research in theory and society, in new media and society, in anthropology now, in the American Anthropologist, in the IEEE Annals of the History of Computing. We are delighted that you're here and that you're willing to get up early in the morning and also end our day in such a lovely way. So Shreeharsh, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that very lovely introduction. So I'm very thrilled to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Just to quickly introduce myself, for those who came in late, I'm Shreeharsh Kelkar. I'm a lecturer at UC Berkeley in the Interdisciplinary Studies program. I was trained in science and technology studies, and I consider myself a historian and an ethnographer of science and technology. And in my research, I focus on questions of software, algorithms, and platforms, and how they are changing workplaces, work practices, and expertise. And the talk today that I'm going to give is about the politics of knowledge and governance in platforms and the new kinds of work and expertise that emerge, and what all of that means for us as citizens and policymakers. So it's part of the manuscript I'm currently writing, which is now, the title is now different from the one that Noah pointed out. So I've changed the title in the interim. So now the manuscript is called Platformizing Learning, the Politics of Knowledge and Governance in the World of MOOCs. So the same title as the talk. So let me start with the question of platform governance, a topic that, as many of you might know, is much in the news today. The term platform is used today by management theorists and social scientists alike to denote digital intermediaries who manage multi-sided markets. So essentially, platforms are digital infrastructures that connect a set of service providers to those who want those services. So for instance, YouTube is a platform for small and large video producers, video consumers, and advertisers. Uber is a platform for drivers and riders. And all of these constituencies are considered users of these platforms. Governance, the interests of platform companies and their users, or the interests of different users diverge. So for instance, on Facebook, many users consider pictures of breastfeeding as inappropriate, while many others consider it okay. On Uber, drivers would prefer to be paid more, naturally, but Uber's riders want lower costs for their rides, and Uber itself wants to ensure that it makes profits for its shareholders. And scholars have typically argued that platforms govern their users through a mixture of rules and algorithms. So for rules, platforms create rules around content. So for example, you might be familiar, all posts with COVID-19 on Facebook now come with a warning message. Or they may have rules that certain kinds of images of animals constitute animal abuse and should be marked as disturbing. So these are the rules I've shown in this figure. And they then enforce these rules by using a mixture of algorithmic systems and low-paid contract workers, something that has been written about by Tarleton Gillespie, and Sarah Roberts has a book about it. Platforms also use algorithms to guide users into what you might call more optimal behavior. So for instance, YouTube uses an autoplay algorithm to play a video after the current one has finished, and it recommends a set of videos for you based on what other users like you have watched. Uber sends nudges to its drivers. So example, asking them to drive to a particular area where there might be more demand, or as you can see in this picture, incentivizing them to drive longer. And so in this talk, I will argue that expand beyond the question of rules and algorithms.
She got a date and 1 o'clock was 2 o'clock until 2 o'clock she tried. After 2 o'clock.
Aspects of platform governance. These elements of platform governance, sort of the rules that come from nowhere, can often leave users feeling frustrated and neglected to the point where they may exit the platform. So no one likes to be treated like a number or a data point. Uber drivers and YouTube content creators want the platforms they use to address the particular problems they face when they use them. But the existing research doesn't have a lot to say about how platforms respond to user dissatisfaction. So in the first part of this talk, by drawing on my ethnographic research in the world of massive open online courses, or MOOCs, I will show how platform governance is also about aiding and persuading a platform's users to achieve particular goals, just as much as it is about these impersonal rules that platforms enforce. Specifically, I will focus on a form of labor that I call relationship labor that platforms use to manage their users. Relationship labor refers to the labor of platform employees who engage in interpersonal communications with a platform's users to persuade them to incorporate their voice into the platform's goals and to prevent their exit. Relationship labor is both an underappreciated component of platform governance, I will argue, and an increasingly important form of work in platforms that policymakers and others should pay attention to. Similarly, the literature on algorithms ends up overemphasizing the power of behavioral modification or nudging. So for instance, Shoshana Zuboff argued in her research that this sort of algorithmic behavioral modification is quite dangerous, and more dangerous than other forms of persuasion, because algorithmic systems can keep nudging people over and over and over based on highly granular surveillance data. And the result, she argues, is the complete inhibition of human freedom and autonomy. And this is not necessarily incorrect, but it is a bit overinflated. And such claims can sometimes end up reinforcing the hype that platform companies themselves like to propagate. And so in the second half of this talk, I will show ethnographically that the process of producing knowledge about a platform's users is not fait accompli. It is messy and contested, and nudges can fail just as much as they succeed. And instead, what I will do is I will shift the focus from the question of control to the question of expertise, which is the ways in which platform designers conceptualize their users and the creation of new tasks and problems around those conceptualizations. So for instance, MOOC reformers, the people I studied, modeled learners and instructors as users and as domain experts simultaneously. And this imagination shaped the ways in which they constructed problems and solved them. So thinking with expertise tells us more about how our institutions are digitizing than the specter of algorithmic control. So all of these findings are based on my fieldwork in the world of massive open online courses, or MOOCs. And I just wanted to give a brief introduction to MOOCs, just in case people are unfamiliar with it, but I assume most people in academia are familiar with it. MOOCs are online courses that include videos and machine-graded assessments, and they are typically taken by a large number of people. Typically, anyone with an internet connection can take them. From 2013 to 2015, I was embedded as a participant observer at the MOOC company edX and 4 of its partners, the MOOC divisions of MIT, Harvard, Berkeley, and Stanford. I spent around 4 to 6 months at each site, attending meetings, public and semi-public events, conducting formal and informal interviews, following people to conferences, and reading the circulating documents. At each site, I made a very conscious effort to seek out workers in all the different organizational roles. So programmers, instructors, researchers, support staff, video producers, instructional designers, TAs, postdocs, data scientists, learning researchers, and many, many more. So before I get into my findings, I sort of wanted to introduce both MOOCs and the people who were in the MOOC movement to the audience. So in 2012, 3 new startups, Udacity, Coursera, and edX, emerged to offer this new kind of online course. And as I said before, these courses had video lectures and machine-graded assessments and could be taken by anyone with an internet connection. Typically, learners who finished got certificates, and these courses and the companies that offered them, somewhat confusingly, both of them came to be called MOOCs. Because of the hype around MOOCs and also the criticisms of them that I was hearing, I went into my fieldwork expecting to find that the reformers making MOOCs would be sort of libertarian market fundamentalists who believed that higher education was about job training, that inefficient universities had failed in this responsibility, and that the best way to reform universities was by introducing market competition. Surprisingly, that was not what I found. I found that the MOOC movement was fairly diverse and consisted of 3 factions that I will call engineers, online learning specialists, and learning scientists. All were reformers interested in transforming educational institutions and educational knowledge production. Many, if not most, believed in the idea of education as a public good. All were strongly attracted by the kinds of participation they found on internet platforms, as well as to the knowledge practices such as agile software development, data mining, and A/B testing that they also saw happening behind the scenes on internet platforms. The differences between the MOOC reformers came not so much from their views about markets or universities, but from the ways in which they imagined the learner and the instructor and the kinds of internet platforms they took inspiration from. The engineers were inspired by the scale of internet platforms, the online learning specialists were inspired by virtual communities, and the learning scientists were most interested in building a science of learning. These MOOC reformers hailed from 2 different American traditions. They were often pedagogical progressives or cyber utopians or both. Since the early 20th century, pedagogical progressives had stressed the importance of a child-centered education and argued that teaching must adapt to the child rather than the other way around. Cyber utopianism, which emerged during the Cold War, was the idea that network computing, by giving you access to information, could set you free. And these 2 traditions, pedagogical progressivism and cyber utopianism, came together in the 1980s as educational researchers redefined the site of education from schools to learning environments, and the agent of education from a child or a student to a learner or a community of practice. All of which is to say, by the 1990s, the idea of learning had become much more malleable and decoupled from its earlier conception as occurring mostly in schools. And it could therefore be taken up by a variety of reformers, such as those around MOOCs, with different ideas about the role of online education. So in the rest of this talk, I will work through sort of my two main contributions. First, I will describe the practices of relationship labor in platforms through a case study of how the MOOC company edX managed its users. And then in part two, I will describe a debate about the role of videos in MOOCs to show how the process of knowledge production in platforms is contested and how MOOC reformers are using the framework of platforms to think about teaching and learning. So, part one. So edX, the company I studied, emerged out of the many developments of 2011 and 2012 here in the US. In the fall of 2011, Stanford University caused a storm by releasing 3 courses out into the wild. Courses, like I said, that combined lectures and assessments and could be taken by anyone. And these were the first MOOCs. Inspired by Stanford, MIT offered up its own MOOC on circuits and electronics in December 2011. In January 2012, the Stanford MOOCs became the for-profit venture-funded companies Udacity and Coursera. And in response, MIT and Harvard therefore created a new non-profit MOOC company, edX, by pooling together a cool $30 million each. edX, a non-profit, would build MOOCs by collaborating with partners. Its first partners were Harvard and MIT, naturally, but the plan was to have many others. By the time I finished my fieldwork in 2015, edX had almost 100 partners and more than 600 courses on its portal. To achieve this kind of scale, edX adopted the platform model of organization. So it would build a software that instructors and researchers at partner institutions could draw on to produce courses and to do educational research. And in using this model, edX was trying to style its relationship to partnering institutions as resembling the one between the iPhone and the various app developers who make apps for the iPhone, or between YouTube and all of its video producers. And in doing so, edX turned its partners into users of its software. By this, I mean that edX partners were both constrained by the features of the software that edX built, but also autonomous in that they could use those features for their own vision of teaching and learning. There were 2 reasons that the edX management chose to go with this platform model. First, while edX had about $60 million in seed funding, and it was a nonprofit, so it didn't have to make profits, it still needed a business model to break even for financial sustainability. And by turning partners into users of its software, edX could scale up. And the edX management believed that with enough number of partners and courses, at least some of the learners could be motivated into paying for the course, which would then make edX financially sustainable. Second, edX saw itself and its partners as part of a social movement for educational reform. The platform arrangement provided a way to elicit participation from all of these diverse reformers by letting them craft their own pedagogy. So edX didn't have to impose a pedagogical model on them. They could sort of do their own thing. And this way it could sort of harness a diverse group of reformers into its project. But the twin goals of financial stability and educational reform could conflict with each other. And this was the edX management's central challenge when it came to governing the platform. The company had to encourage instructors and researchers at edX's partner institutions to generate innovative courses and research, while also ensuring that edX itself maintained control over the terms of the reform agenda and broke even financially. So it had to find ways to resolve and mitigate conflict. So what if partners disagreed with each other or with the edX management on what features of the software were important? So as edX's first director of product put it to me in an interview, there are these 2 parts of our mission: innovation in education, and there's really just pure commerce, becoming a consumer product. And that, I think, is probably where more tension exists in our ecosystem than any place else. This, of course, is the challenge of platform governance: how to manage conflicts between users or between users and the platform. In Albert Hirschman's terms, it is about how to incorporate users' voice, prevent their exit, while also maintaining control of the agenda. These were were not problems that could be solved by coming up with rules or algorithms. Instead, to manage these tensions in the ecosystem, created a services team to interface with its partners. The members of the services team went by titles like program manager, relationship manager, and these program managers or PMs carried out what I call in the stock as relationship. Relationship labor is the work done by agents of the platform company who engage in interpersonal communication with the platform's users to try to sustain their engagement with the platform. The edX PMs engaged in two sets of practices that I'll call account management practices and community management practices. Account management practices were aimed at addressing users' particular problems and concerns. Community management practices were designed to bring users together to collaborate with one another. Typically, each edX PM worked with a certain set of partners and engaged in some communications with the instructors and researchers at those partners. They advised them on how to use the edX software by directing these users to the appropriate documentation, especially when they ran into difficulties. And they also brought the concerns and needs of these instructors and researchers to the attention of edX's engineering team. So they could become advocates within the edX organization for prioritizing features of the software that would help their users. It helped that they worked shoulder to shoulder with edX's engineering team. So as one of the PMs told me in an interview, if something is urgent, I can walk 10 feet away and find the person who will help me fix it. And yet, more often than not, PMs were unable to immediately persuade edX developers to build or fix the features that their instructors requested, leaving PMs with few options other than to advise course teams to temper their expectations and adjust their courses to accommodate the limitations of the software. And they often did this by pointing their users to edX's roadmap, which is what I've shown in the slide, which listed upcoming features in development. The edX roadmap was a key way of managing user expectations and incorporating their voice into edX's vision. The PMs also engaged in community management practices by creating opportunities for users to collaborate with each other to achieve common goals under the careful supervision of the edX management. So the edX PMs created and managed communicative forums for instructors and researchers, which is what I've shown on the left, and actively made efforts to find users with common interests to connect to each other. These included sort of both online spaces, so mailing lists and discussion forums, as well as in-person events like conferences and meetups. So what does all this mean? Scholars often speak of platform governance, mostly in terms of impersonal rules and procedures. But as the case of edX shows, it is also about aiding and persuading users to engage with the platform, helping prevent the exit of dissatisfied users, and sometimes taking user concerns to management. This work, this labor, is done by relationship workers who work for platform companies. In a co-authored paper with Ben Shestakovsky, we compared relationship labor at two different platforms. So Ben conducted ethnographic fieldwork at another platform called Alldone, which was a platform for buyers and sellers of services like wedding planning, photography, plumbing, guitar lessons. And Alldone was like edX in that it was an early stage platform and was focused on scale. So it was focused on expanding the number of its users. It was, however, unlike edX in that it was a for-profit venture-funded platform. It had no reform agenda whatsoever, and its management was committed more than anything to delivering returns for its venture capital investors. Yet, in both of these different and similar platforms, we found that relationship workers, account management, and community management practices to aid and persuade users to engage with the platform. This suggests that relationship labor is an underappreciated aspect of platform governance and a new kind of labor that occurs in platforms. In fact, without relationship labor, many platforms simply wouldn't deliver on their promise to users. I would say that relationship labor is sort of a key form of maintenance labor in platforms. But our comparative work also revealed differences between the two platforms in terms of their strategies for deploying relationship labor and the status of their relationship workers. So Alldone's relationship labor was reactive and primarily carried out to stop user exit, while edX's was at least partially about incorporating user voice. All done used low-wage contractors working far from corporate headquarters, so in Las Vegas and Philippines, to carry out this relationship labor, while edX's relationship workers were high status and worked alongside the programming team. In recent years, scholars have become interested in the future of work. While management theorists like Eric Bjorkson, Andrew McAfee have argued that the recent advances in machine learning could presage a new age of automation, social scientists like Mary Gray and Siddharth Suri in their new book, Ghost Work, show conclusively that a lot of our so-called automated programs rely on hidden, low-status human labor that is often offshored and carried out behind the curtain. And in fact, many machine learning programs, Gray and Suri argue, create spaces for new kinds of human labor. So Gray and Suri make the case that policymakers should preemptively ensure that these new forms of labor should be well regulated. And our work with edX and Aldan suggests that relationship labor is another kind of labor that gets created by the scale of platforms, but it is different from the kinds of API-enabled routine work documented by Gray and Suri in Ghost Work, in that it involves actual interpersonal communication between relationship workers and users. It may even be high status, as we saw in the case of edX. So as more platforms are forced to actually make revenue from users rather than speculative funding from venture capital, they may be forced to rely more and more on relationship labor to keep users satisfied. So with that, let me move to part 2, where I will describe the politics of knowledge and control in platform governance. So in this section, I will describe a debate about the role of videos in MOOCs. And my goal here is to show that the process of knowledge production in platforms is contested. And the interesting thing here is not so much the question of control as much as how platform designers think about their users. So in other words, the question of expertise. So in 2014, at the Learning at Scale conference, 3 authors from edX published a study titled How Video Production Affects Student Engagement, an empirical study of MOOC videos. In this study, the authors presented an observational style analysis of 7 million video sessions of 862 videos from 4 edX courses. So big data, as they would call it. They investigated how long learners stayed engaged in the instructional video. So how much of the video did they watch before stopping? The paper consisted of a series of observational findings paired with a hands-on recommendation. So for example, the first graph shows the drop-off in engagement with the length of the video. So you can see the red line keeps going down, which maps to the recommendation that partners invest in pre-production to produce shorter videos. The second graph, again from the paper, shows that the drop-off in engagement is less for videos with talking heads than for videos that don't have talking heads. So you can see one decreases faster than the other, which leads to the recommendation to record and insert talking heads at opportune times. Oh, I see there's a chat. So the publication of this paper, the publication of how video production affects student engagement, was not a random occurrence. It was part of a larger debate about MOOCs and videos and learning that was swirling in the world of MOOCs. If the New York Times had been bullish about MOOCs in 2012, it called 2012 the year of the MOOC, by 2013, a bearish backlash against MOOCs had already begun. Studies had started to reveal that MOOC learners were often people who had at least a bachelor's degree. So as one report put it, MOOCs were educating the educated. But even among these learners, studies found that most of these learners, most of them, sometimes even up to 95% of them, did not complete a MOOC. And this was what came to be known as the completion or dropout narrative. Across the board, MOOC reformers, whether they were engineers or online learning specialists or learning scientists, were profoundly dissatisfied with this narrative. So as one of them told me, there was this strong rhetoric about what makes a MOOC successful as completion rates for a course. And we thought that this was an oversimplification that wasn't making space for other ways of being successful. So what were these other ways of being successful? In Deconstructing Disengagement, one of the most cited papers about MOOCs, the authors point to 4 types of learning trajectories in MOOCs. Of these, completing, that is finishing all the activities in the course, is only one and perhaps the least interesting. The other three trajectories included disengaging, which means completing assessments only at the beginning of the course, but continuing to watch the course videos. Auditing, which means watching only the videos, but skipping the assessments throughout the class. And sampling, which is watching videos only at the beginning of the course and then kind of stopping. MOOC reformers use these findings to argue that MOOC learners were learning in ways that standard measures of learning, which is essentially completing a course to get a grade, were just not able to measure. So as another well-cited paper argued, all the four educational concepts of enrollment, participation, curriculum, and achievement would have to be rethought in the light of MOOCs. But this left MOOC reformers in a somewhat strange position. On the one hand, in pedagogical theory, video-based instruction was considered suboptimal in terms of achieving robust learning outcomes. So essentially, learning theory says, you should do stuff. Just watching stuff doesn't get you to learn. So videos had always sort of have a low reputation in learning theory. On the other hand, videos and MOOCs were enormously popular with learners who sometimes reported that they would listen to these videos on the way to and fro from work, like as one does with podcasts, or that they watched the videos because their whole point of taking the class was to help their child with her homework, etc. But it got even murkier. If edX was to be financially sustainable, as we discussed in the first part of this talk, that could only happen if enough learners paid to get a certificate and thereby completed the course. But most learners preferred consuming the content to doing the assessments. So it was important then that the authors and the samplers stay engaged in the course to the point where they might consider paying for a certificate. Some MOOC reformers captured this point using the concept of the marketing or engagement funnel, which is used by marketers, including online marketers, to think about the process of getting a consumer who is aware of a product into actually purchasing a product, right? So this is the funnel. Like you get a lot of people at the beginning, but then they winnow down. And what you want to do is get more people at the end of the funnel. MOOC reformers use this funnel concept to think about both certifications and about learning itself. So a much cited 2013 paper analyzing the activity of MOOC learners called it the funnel of participation, how to get MOOC learners from being simply aware of a course to engaging with it in particular ways. The paper's author argued, however, that he was not proposing that there was some fixed outcome that all MOOC learners had to be incentivized to reach, but that reformers needed to think of different open-ended conceptions of what it would mean to learn in a MOOC and funnel learners to those outcomes. I want to emphasize here that this was not a distinction between crass business-minded people who wanted to earn money from MOOCs and earnest educators interested in more open-ended notions of learning outcomes. Rather, these two things, the financial sustainability of MOOCs and the openness to different forms of learning, were inextricably intertwined. And it is in this that the findings and thrust of how video production affects student engagement should be understood. I will argue that the paper illustrates how MOOC reformers had platformized learning by configuring MOOC learners as platform users who had to be funneled into more substantive engagements. This had happened as a result of the convergence of two trends: the decoupling of learning from schools and the fusing of learning with open-ended participation on platforms. The platformization of learning and the configuring of learners as platform users went hand in hand with the reimagining of educational expertise. So consider, for instance, how the authors of How Video Production Affects Student Engagement ground the interpretation of their quantitative findings in the qualitative testimony of people that they call domain experts. In this case, the video producers working at edX. So as the paper puts it, this particular set of findings, so the finding being that shorter videos are more engaging, resonated most strongly with video producers we interviewed at edX. Ever since edX formed, producers had been urging instructors at partner institutions to split up lessons into chunks of less than 6 minutes based solely upon their prior intuitions. Video producers are now using our data to make a more evidence-based case to instructors. So what the authors do here is enlist other experts, the video producers, to explain their finding through this figure of the domain expert. They also, in a somewhat circular fashion that is common to data scientists, turn these other experts, these video producers, into users of their findings, along with the ultimate end users, the instructors. And in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk more about where this domain expert category comes from. The finding that shorter videos are more engaging was not uncontested. It, or at least the version of it in this particular paper, received strong pushback from some of the learning scientists who argued that it generalized too much from only 4 very particular courses. So as one learning scientist from Harvard argued in a blog post, short videos are better for learning, right? Maybe not. And as he put it in that post, the study doesn't appear to account for the purposes or function of particular videos. And I want to emphasize that the fact that this criticism was not made in private, he actually wrote the blog post, tells you that this was a serious disagreement. By alluding to the purpose and function of particular videos, the learning scientists were arguing that the authors of the paper had chosen the wrong domain experts to ground their analysis, and that the domain experts in question should have been learning scientists themselves, and to a smaller extent, instructors. So in a sense, this is not a disagreement with the finding, it's a disagreement of sort of the reasoning, if you will, behind the finding. The edX management, however, embraced the finding, and it is now part of edX's documentation for its partners. So edX tells partners that video engagement drops when videos exceed 6 to 9 minutes, and therefore partners should try to stay within this range. Now note that it could have been possible for edX to just configure its software such that, if instructors made videos of more than 10 minutes, the software would just reject it. And that would have been one way of governing their instructors. But that is not what they did. Instead, the finding was embedded into the software as a recommendation. In doing so, edX hoped to guide its instructors into productive yet open-ended behaviors. The edX management also started to build video engagement dashboards into the edX software so that instructors and researchers at partner institutions could see how learners engage with videos. And the creation of the dashboard shows how a highly contingent finding about the length of the videos was black boxed to shape the behavior of instructors and learners, but in an open-ended fashion. So what you see here is a dashboard, and essentially it's showing you how many people watched. So this is the length of the video. You can see less and less people watch the video as it go along, and there's this very weird peak somewhere in the middle. And so it's not clear why, but many people seem to be watching that part of the video more than others, but nobody really knows why. So that's kind of what the dashboard does for instructors and researchers. So the story of the video debate that I described should alert us that just as platforms don't give us absolute freedom, they also don't exert absolute control, as some platform theorists have argued. Indeed, the process of producing knowledge about users is messy and contested. Nudges can fail just as often as they succeed. Platforms are sites where, as some theorists have said, control is radically distributed while power remains centralized. And the task of platform governance is to maintain this balance between user autonomy and platform control. For MOOC reformers, however, and this is important to emphasize, this balance between control and autonomy emerged organically through their traditions. As pedagogical progressives and cyber utopians, they wanted education to be learner-centered, with both instructors and learners to enjoy autonomy, while also being committed to certain best practices of learning. And it was these traditions and their organizational imperatives that shaped how they adopted the new knowledge practices of the software industry, including data mining, A/B testing, and behavioral modification. I will argue instead that the video debate is a story about expertise. And I use the word expertise here specifically rather than experts, drawing on the sociologist Jill Ayal's definition of expertise as an enabling network of devices, institutional arrangements, and practices that enable the creation of new tasks and problems. So expertise is not the same as experts. And the key to separating expertise from experts is that the power of expertise can increase even as the power of particular experts might decrease. For example, historians, economic sociologists, anthropologists, STS scholars like Daniel Breslov, Elizabeth Bob Berman have pointed to the increasing economization, as they call it, of policy in the last few decades. And their point is not so much a reference to the power of economists as much as it is to the power of economic expertise or economic reasoning, a style of reasoning built on top of knowledge practices in which everything is understood as an input or output of something that's called an economy and quantified in terms of indicators. The rise of economic reasoning may not just empower economists, but also other experts who are able to practice it. Similarly, I will argue that this platform arrangement creates new tasks and problems and new styles of reasoning about those problems. What is being assembled within the innards of platforms is something that I'd like to call platform expertise, a style of knowing and acting and reasoning in which people who come into contact with institutions are modeled as users, domain experts, or even both, and who are governed in a manner such that they are both autonomous and controlled. Platform expertise also rests on a set of knowledge practices that drawn from the world of the software industry and internet platforms, such as agile methods, A/B testing, and data mining. Thinking about and with platform expertise, I will argue, can help us as policymakers or sort of as the broader public, think about what happens to our institutions as they get increasingly digitized and platformized. And here I think the case of MOOCs is more than relevant. When MOOCs burst on the scene back in 2012, there was a lot of hype that they were going to change the face of American higher education. That hype has mercifully died down, and MOOCs have now become, as the educational scholar Justin Reich has written, service providers who help universities set up their online master's programs. But the processes that MOOCs exemplified are still ongoing. The process of platformizing learning and the desire to draw on the knowledge practices of internet platforms to think about learning was not just something that was felt by Silicon Valley engineers. Instead, as we saw, this was felt by reformers of many different political persuasions and traditions. How these reformers draw on those practices and how they end up creating new tasks and problems will determine how knowledge about learners is produced, who gets to produce this knowledge, and how learning infrastructures are designed. And just as there are educational reformers, there are reformers in other institutions, many of whom are also attracted to the knowledge practices of internet platforms. So the concept of platform expertise, this particular style of reasoning, offers insights into the processes that will shape the future of a broad array of our institutions for generations to come. So to sum up, I guess I've reached the end. The goal of this talk was to complicate our pictures of what platform governance looks like through a detailed ethnographic study of the knowledge practices in a MOOC platform. And the talk has three key takeaways. First, that in addition to rules and digital technologies, platforms use a form of labor that I call relationship labor to manage their users. Relationship labor refers to the labor of platform employees who engage in interpersonal communications with the platform's users to persuade them to incorporate their voice and prevent their exit. If platforms are the future, then I would suggest that scholars and policymakers should pay more attention to these new forms of labor that are crucial to platforms. Second, the process of producing knowledge about a platform's users for behavioral modification is contested. And instead of focusing on the problem of algorithmic control, I suggest that scholars and policymakers focus on the construction of platform expertise, styles of reasoning emerging within institutions as they start to adopt the knowledge practices from internet platforms. These styles of reasoning tell us a great deal about how digitization is changing our institutions. Last but not the least, I hope the third contribution of this talk is methodological. So I hope that I've showed the power of ethnographic methods to think about the promises and perils of platforms. Thinking carefully in terms of what people actually do with and around platforms helps us both to take them seriously as new things in the world without taking at face value some of the marketing hype that swirls around them continuously. So thank you. I'll end here and I would be happy to take questions.
Shreeharsh, that was wonderful. Thank you very, very much. So now the floor is open to questions. I'll shut down the share screen, or you shut down the share screen.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, the floor is now open. You're all muted, so you can unmute yourself.
I would love to ask a question. First of all, thank you for that amazing lecture. I learned so much about MOOCs and the forces behind it. My question relates to the fact that MOOCs are, when they are coming into the academic domain as a content movement. They are fighting something. They are having an agenda against the agenda of the traditional learning, the traditional lecture in front of the class, and that agenda is very has a lot of years behind it, as a heritage, a very good heritage behind it. And the question is how that interest or even politics of being the winning agenda affects the way that the platform is being formed. So there is many things that you talked about them here that forms the platform, but do you feel that this agenda changed the way the platform is created as we are seeing it today?
That's a great question. So I think there is certainly some, like you said, there are at least some people who have an agenda sort of that goes against sort of the traditional sort of ways of we have thought about educational institutions. But like I said, there were many people in the MOOC movement who didn't necessarily buy that agenda, but they still supported MOOC. So one example is online learning specialists who were a big part of the MOOC movement. And over the last few years, what's happened in higher education, and in the US at least, is that a lot of our higher ed students are working adults. So these are not necessarily the people who can take classes from 9 to 5. These are people who work, and so they have increasingly needed flexibility in what they do. So the online learning specialists had always been concerned that the needs of these students were not being adequately met in higher ed institutions who had neglected sort of online learning. And at least in the US context, these learners had sort of turned to for-profits. So they supported MOOCs as part of their broader mission to sort of make learning more flexible for these working adults. Now, you could argue that in doing so, they were supporting the agenda of other people who may have had a different reason for supporting online learning. So all of which is to say that there was a politics of MOOCs, but the different motivations that the different reformers had were very different. And ultimately, I would argue what the outcome is going to be determined by organizational conditions. Because edX had, edX was both a reform company, but it also had to be financially sustainable. So though the sort of conflict between those two objectives guided the ways in which the edX platform evolved, you could argue that a different kind of platform, which is, which has a different set of constraints. So it's made, it's a for-profit, or it has a different kind of reform agenda, would make different decisions. But I would argue that the politics of MOOCs is open-ended, because while it is, I would not at all say that there are no people in the MOOC movement who don't want to sort of like completely change universities. They are also, there are other soldiers in the MOOC movement who might support this agenda for very different reasons. So they would still believe in a public higher education, but they think there should be more online learning and more sort of acceptance of different forms of learning. So, people just watch videos, that we should encourage that, right? We shouldn't just like say, oh, you need to get a grade to finish it. So what happens and to what end MOOCs go, I think will depend on the conflicts between the different reformers with their agendas.
Well,
That's the answer. Yeah.
just to follow up for 1 second, and Oshra is waiting to ask a question, but you've had the opportunity to do the comparison that you just referred to. Are there differences that you can point to between an edX course and a Coursera course that you would attribute to what you were just talking about, to the different?
Yeah, so Coursera is a great example because Coursera is a for-profit, venture-funded MOOC platform. But Coursera also thought of itself. So I did not get access to Coursera because Coursera is it's a for-profit, so it doesn't want like ethnographers messing around there. But Coursera is I would say has changed in its trajectory. So at the beginning, at least, Coursera too had a reformist goal, but they were constrained by other factors. So for instance, Coursera was much less forthcoming with the data that it gave to the partners. So Coursera had the same model. It had partners, they took courses, but the Coursera partners often expressed more like dissatisfaction with the way Coursera gave them data to analyze, to do research. So they would often fight for it. But I would argue they fought for it and got it. So they had the power to demand it, and that happened. Coursera is also sort of more interested now in like building online master's programs, because that's where the cash is. And Coursera has to, Coursera just went public. So they really want, money. So I would argue, like going forward, they might be more interested in doing things that get them there. edX, in the meanwhile, of course, is also in the online master's programs business. But edX has the opportunity, because it's a nonprofit, to do things like, have a course on Chinese history, or a course on global architecture, which is not going to earn much money, but has a different purpose in the world. So yes, there are differences definitely between them that correspond to their organizational imperatives. Yeah.
Thank you. Oshra?
Yes. First of all, thank you for your interesting lecture. I would certainly be going to read more from your studies, papers, because I'm in my first steps to write a paper about MOOCs. I would like to understand whether this technology medium of MOOCs have a role to play in pushing people towards higher education. I would like to know about the general population, but even more so focusing on those who are the first generation of college. In this context, I know at least one project here in Israel who declares that his vision is to promote opportunities for personal development and lifelong learning in order to close the social gap. By the way, our state is funding this project. And I would like to ask, have you come across studies, evidence, examples of more projects with similar vision? What do you think about that in the context of STS? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I didn't quite catch what the goal of this project was. You said the one you mentioned, the one in Israel.
Oshra, you're muted. It's not your fault. It's my fault. I muted you when you were done, but.
Yes, they promote opportunities for personal developments and lifelong learning in order to close social gaps, to create equality for opportunities for diverse groups, and provide flexible solution to the new labor market.
Yeah, so actually there have been many studies of MOOCs published over the last few years, because now it's been almost 10 years. And what all of them show is that while MOOC learners they are autodidacts, they really want to do lifelong learning, they are already sort of privileged people. So the people who it helps the most are people who already have a college degree and are working, and maybe they need to take a course to better their employment prospects and so on. And this is true across the board. So for instance, After the US, the most MOOC learners come from India. And of course, you can argue that the ones from India are, of course, less privileged than the ones in the US. But even in India, they come from sort of people who already have a degree and so on. So by now, it is fairly clear that the people who benefit from it, and again, these are good benefits. We shouldn't sneeze at them. But they are not necessarily what you would say. So they are improving access, but this is not the kind of access that you want, say, for getting somebody to who's never been to college, to sort of first generation college student, for instance. That stuff doesn't work with the MOOC model. For that, I mean, online learning would still be a part of it, but it requires extensive sort of intervention to make sure that they are on track. So this is sort of an old problem, at least here in the US. Community colleges often have this model where they have students who are not there to complete a degree. They're there for some other reason. And what they have to do is build systems to sort of make sure that these students finish, or at least that these students get what they want. So, you know, they need, what do you call it? Like, advisors. You need a lot of advisors, and you need to have regular checkups with these students to say, okay, how are you doing? Are you on track? If not, what's the problem? MOOCs don't offer any of that. So if the goal of the access is for like students who are probably never going to finish college, to give them access, this model, it is clear at this point, doesn't work. But if the goal is to sort of build new forms of learning around like continuing education, people like to learn more. There are, parents who would like to learn more to sort of teach their children. There are people who want to change jobs. For all of those people, I think MOOCs are a form of lifelong learning. That would be my take.
Thank you. Shalev?
Yeah, hi. Shreeharsh, thank you very much for the wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. And I wanted, I'm a teacher, and like many teachers this year, it was a very complicated year, but I spent the first half of the year on Zoom, as you know, and I felt like I was, there was back and forth. I felt like I was getting knowledge across, and there were different things I tried to do to test that they were actually learning, which reminded me of things that you showed in this talk, ways to try and get feedback to see if something that I'm saying is going into people's heads. But then we came back to, then we entered the classroom, we re-entered the classroom. And I found that much of what I had taught, it stayed surface level. I mean, they learned it, they processed it, but then they were unable to hold on to it for very long. The information wasn't in depth. It stayed here. And I'm curious if there are follow-up, if there's any data on that, if people follow up and see, I don't know, a year later, do people remember what they, the knowledge that they acquired in these courses or not? I mean, what does the learning go? Is it in depth? And is there a way to test it? That's my question.
That's a good question. This is a little bit out of my ballpark because I mean, I'm a teacher and I studied MOOCs, but I'm not a learning scientist, so I wouldn't exactly know. But I think if I put on sort of how the people in my fieldwork would respond to that, I think they would say that it really depends on your learning objectives. I mean, again, I had similar experiences teaching with Zoom, and they might suggest that what you want to do is design a class around learning objectives, and the learning objectives are going to be different based on the modality of the instruction. And this is again what used to happen in MOOCs all the time, right? Like people would say, why are these people just watching videos? Well, they were just watching the videos because they were not interested in the rest of the class, but they were probably learning a lot from the videos. And so the goal was to make sure that, you want it to be learner centered. So you want to make sure that people actually achieve the goals that they want to achieve. So a lot of the research in MOOCs They did a lot of interesting stuff around like administering surveys to students at the beginning of class, where they asked the students to specify their objectives. They love doing these sorts of research, and then sort of trying to channel people based on the objectives, and then comparing what they achieved in relation to those objectives that they specified at the beginning of the class. What the reformers would say is that the learning objectives themselves need to change to sort of accommodate the different modalities. Now, that's very hard to do, I think, for a class like the one we teach, where, I teach a research methods class, for instance, and I have a very clear goal, which is at the end of the class, the student should be able to write a senior thesis. So it doesn't matter what objectives they had in the class. I need them to be able to do this, otherwise they won't be able to write their senior thesis. So that actually makes it harder. So that was actually harder to do. So I don't know if it solves the problems for us, but I think one thing the MOOC reformers, at least from my fieldwork, would suggest is like, if it is hard to get something done, then it might be that we have the wrong learning objectives. And so what might be better is to just change those and then adapt the course to them.
Thank you.
Can you describe in a little more detail the ways in which I think you call them the pedagogical reformers, and the pedagogical progressives and the reformers viewed MOOCs, and how it changed over the time that you did fieldwork? It seems as though there was a sobering up that you described as well from the 2011, from the beginning of this and your fieldwork went until 2015.
Yeah.
And I wonder what impact the experience had on those people, and whether there were feedback loops, whether they changed their goals for MOOCs in a way that changed the entire system.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the biggest learning, the changing of minds that happened was with the engineers who had been attracted sort of by the promise of scale. So the engineers essentially had like 4 different inspirations. So they liked Khan Academy, which is a video-based mathematics site. They liked lynda.com. I don't know if you've heard of that. That's like it's a place where anybody can teach classes, and classes can be from how to file taxes to like how to cook. They like Stack Overflow, which is where coders talk to each other. And they like YouTube, where again you can find a lot of how-to videos on like how to repair your kitchen sink to like how to tie your shoelaces. So, and all this happens at scale. And I think engineers were really sort of interested in the idea of scaling a lot of different things. So if you can do that, if you can scale all these things, also scale like first generation learners who are, who often find it difficult to finish a course, can you sort of scale up those sorts of things? I think what the engineers would say that they've realized that the pursuit of scale in education it can satisfy other objectives, but it may not satisfy an objective like bringing underprivileged people into the higher education sector. So I think they have had the most changes in their outlook. The other 2 groups, I think, the other 2 groups, I would say, always knew this because, for instance, the online learning specialists had always worked with students who were like continuing first generation students or people who were already working, and they knew how hard it was to retain those students. So they didn't necessarily have that much of a sort of change, but I think what they took from MOOCs was the ways in which like you can use data mining, the ways you can use all these sorts of analytics to actually help learners and instructors do certain things. I think the learning scientists are the ones who probably had most, because they were sort of, it was like the promise of big data and the promise of doing experimentation and like doing real world experiments. And again, they too, I think they have had some success, but they've realized that it's not as easy as it seems. So all of them have changed their
Can
goals.
you say another word or two about who these learning scientists are? I'm embarrassed to say that that's actually a discipline that I've never heard of as such. Are they cognitive scientists? Are they professors of education? Are they who are these learning scientists?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I use it, so there are all of these, but the learning sciences as a term only starts. So essentially before this, we had cognitive science, but then sort of in the 1980s, something starts to happen, which is that cognitive scientists realize that sort of learning is probably more than what happens in the head. And so again, there are a variety of reasons why this happens in the 1980s that I can go into, like socioeconomic reasons. And so what emerges out of this is a hodgepodge that they call the learning sciences. But the learning sciences have like cognitive scientists, they have anthropologists, they have people who work in education schools, they have people who work on intelligent tutoring systems, which is like a sort of a computer sciencey thing to build tutors. So all of these people sort of are grouped under the learning sciences. And what they come at, so they come sort of from the pedagogical progressive tradition. So they all believe in a learner-centered education, but they just have a different ideas about how to go about achieving this learner-centered education. But all of them sort of, again, so again, the two things that in their title are they are interested in learning, and they all consider themselves as scientists of some sort or the other. So that's what I mean by learning scientists. But it's a, yeah.
And what about the groups that weren't among the three groups? What about the conscientious objectors, who I imagine existed as well at the constituent universities at Harvard and MIT? I imagine that there are they just completely segregated from this story, not part of the story, complaining in the faculty club, but nowhere else?
Yeah, some people complain in the faculty club, but I think a lot of the people who are serious about it basically join the movement because they think, because the movement is kind of open-ended, and it was, they joined the movement to change it. So like it's not necessary that everybody in these three groups supported MOOCs, but I think they thought of themselves as, by joining the movement, they have more of a chance of changing it than not. So let me put it this way. All the people, there were a lot of disagreements between the different MOOC reformers, but they disagreed with each other less than they disagreed with critics of MOOCs who only criticized them from the outside. They really thought there were many positive things in it, and they really wanted to join the movement to change it. That would be my guess.
Excellent. Ravit, do you have a question that you want to ask?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I wanted to ask about the type of data. Is there any difference in the impact and the effectiveness of specific platforms in terms of the type of subject that's learned? For instance, chemistry versus engineering versus history versus practical skills. Is there any data regarding that?
There's a if there's a lot of both Harvard and MIT have published these reports. They do it, I think, every 2 years, where they summarize a lot of who takes MOOCs, what happens, etc. And another place I would recommend going to is looking at the proceedings of the Learning at Scale conference, where a lot of some of these results are published. I am not sure about what exactly people have found to be different in like a chemistry class versus like a humanities class. But I think the problem with all of these classes has been that most people don't do the assessments, especially in the MOOC format. They just don't, because that's not why they are there. They are there because, they are interested in chemistry. They are there because it's fun, they are autodidacts. So ultimately, if you really wanted to analyze them from a sort of traditional perspective of like how much are people learning the material, it's hard to say because there are so few of them who actually finish it. What's most interesting, I think, and then that is common across all of these classes, is the number of people who kind of just like come in and out of the class. But I will say I don't actually know if there, people who like look at chemistry learning versus physics learning have actually gone into MOOCs to see what the differences are. I actually don't know that yet. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, I think that brings us to the end of this. Thank you for this wonderful lecture, Shreeharsh. And wait, I'm looking for you. There you And thank you for waking up so early and spending the time with us. This is really, really fascinating, and we look forward to being in touch.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for these great questions. It was really stimulating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Shreeharsh, can I ask you a
Goodbye.
question after hours?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
So people who want to stay and listen to Rolly and are welcome to stay. And
So I just wanted to ask you, but I didn't want to drag the direction of the questions and answers away from the main line. You mentioned the use that you make of styles of reasoning in your analysis. Can you expand on that in the sense that styles of reasoning, as you well know, it's a bag full of things, right? There's a whole new vocabulary, a whole new set of institutions that get involved. Do you use style reasoning in order to denote that there is a specific new style involved here?
Yes.
Yeah. How so? Because I'm very much into this. How much can you elaborate on this?
So the style of reasoning. So I think the video example that I gave is a good example of the kind of style of reasoning, which is that look at sort of how the people, how they. There's a set of knowledge practices that they use. Those knowledge practices, in this case, this was sort of data mining, but other knowledge practices can be A/B testing, which is like doing an experiment. So platforms, internet platforms do a lot of A/B testing. So you can test everything from, do people click on something if I use blue versus green color, to like if I put the search results in a different order, do people actually click on it? So they call it A/B testing. And it's something that you can easily do in internet platforms. So A/B testing, data mining, and then the other thing I think they really do is agile software development, which is a programming style where essentially you program in short bursts. So you do a little bit of something, then you test it on users, then you see what they do, then you keep tweaking it and so on. So these are the three sort of knowledge practices that are very central to internet platforms. So the style of reasoning that I call platform expertise is very dependent on these three sort of knowledge practices. But in addition, I think it has a certain way of thinking. So for instance, in the video debate, as I described, so they found through data mining that shorter videos are more engaging, but they also needed to sort of explain it. And so to explain it, they rely on people that they call domain experts. And so but these domain experts could be anybody, and it really depends on how you decide what the domain is. So in this case, their domain was educational videos, and so that led to a certain kind of outcome. But if their domain had been like learning science, that would have led to some different kind of conclusion. But this idea of using this domain, where the domain itself is really up to you, is again another part of it. So it's a way of thinking about the people who come into contact with institutions as users or domain experts or both. I mean, MOOC people had other ways of thinking too, like they thought of them as crowd workers. That's something I didn't touch on, but that's something I go into in the book. So they have ways of sort of modeling people who come into contact with institutions. So that would be the third thing. And I think the last thing is the use of sort of devices like dashboards. So again, we saw here that they ended up making it into a dashboard. And again, the dashboard is a very open-ended way. So the dashboard actually came in by the time I left my fieldwork. So I don't actually know how many instructors use it, but I can tell you just from seeing how much work the instructors were doing that they would have very little time to actually look at the dashboard. So even here, like it's a style of intervention where you try to maintain this balance between control and autonomy. Like you want to nudge people into doing something, but you also want them to have autonomy. So I would say like these would be the components of this particular platform expertise style of reasoning. And the way it would be deployed, I think would again be different. So I mean, here, the educational reformers had certain ways, they were learner-centered, right? And so they had a particular way of deploying this style of reasoning. But if this was like casino design or digital gambling, then I would assume that they would come down much less on autonomy and much more on control. Like they want gamblers to like keep playing and you know, like, so the balance between autonomy and control would be different, I think, in different sectors. Like Facebook is not probably as much as gambling, but maybe a little bit more than MOOCs.
And you could say that in cases like gambling, they don't really need to reinvent the process. They just need to copy it into the new platform. Whereas in teaching, they keep on, at least the narrative that they're using is, we want to reinvent what teaching is.
Yes.
And so that the platform will enable us to open that box up.
Yes.
Which is another way of saying what you just said about the balance between the autonomy and the, yeah.
Correct. Yes.
By the way, when is this book going to be in a bookstore near us?
Yeah.
I realize that's a horrible question to ask in general, but
I'm still writing the first draft, so hopefully in 2 years.
okay. We're eager
So
to see it.
I'll reserve my chutzpah Israeli to bug you via email, okay?
And a few other people have written as well, and I'm sending them your email, so I hope that that's okay.
Yes, of course.
Wonderful.
That's a great question. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, and we will, of course, be in touch.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shreeharsh. Thank you very much.